Greetings, my name is Christopher Paisley, a Philadelphia public school teacher for Inside White Fragility. Today, I want to ask the question, is anti-racism condemning black children to poverty? Now, branding America's schools as oppressive institutions steeped in white supremacy is great for identity politics, but is it elevating children of color out of poverty and helping them succeed? It's a very good question to ask. Now, recently, a writer, his name is Daniel Bergner, and I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, he wrote an article for the New York Times Magazine, and it was titled, "White Fragility is Everywhere, but Does Anti-Racism Training Work?" It's a good question. These things are popping up everywhere, but are they actually working specifically to help lift children of color, people of color out of poverty and educate children of color so that they can have the skills that they need academically to succeed, especially in school and in the workplace? So what Daniel Bergner did in his New York Times Magazine article is he looked at 3 individuals and tried to analyze what they're doing and see how anti-racism is having an effect on, things like academics and work readiness. So the first person he looked at was Ibram Kendi, who's the winner of the 2016 National Book Award for Nonfiction, and he's the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, which has been on the bestseller lists for the last couple of months. All right, next is DiAngelo, whose book White Fragility has transformed the way we think about race in America. Everybody kind of knows her. She's a household name. Everybody kind of has heard of White Fragility now. And finally, another name which is kind of under the radar, a man named Glen E Singleton, an African-American man. He runs an equity workshop for discussing race called Courageous Conversation. So this article looked at 3 of these people in particular. So I'd like to examine each of these people and take a look at whether their use of anti-racism is actually helping children of color succeed academically and giving them the skills necessary to compete in college and become ready to engage in America's workforce. So let's start with Ibram Kendi, all right? Now, he's an interesting person. He's very successful lately. He was the youngest person ever to win the National Book Award in Nonfiction in 2016. He was only 34 years old, which is a great accomplishment. Currently, he's accepting a position to join Boston University and launch Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research, where he will transform how racial research is done. And by transform, this probably means discounting the traditional approach using the scientific method and using social constructivism to bring in identity politics. Okay, we're going to talk about that more in a second. So, Kendi right now, currently, who is the renowned author and scholar from Queens, New York, he is a Queens, New York product. He's come a long way in the past 17 years. Back in 2003, Kendi, who actually went by his birth name, which is Ibram Henry Rogers, was writing a column for the student newspaper at Florida A&M University. And this column was very interesting, and the articles that he wrote were actually interesting. You really can't find them anymore. But this New Yorker article has pulled up some quotes. So one of the quotes from one of these articles, he stated, "I don't hate whites," he wrote in one of these articles. "How can you hate a group of people for being who they are?" It's kind of a little bit of a radical view. And as reported in the New Yorker, Kendi explained that Europeans had been socialized to be aggressive people and raised to be racist. His theory was that white people were fending off racial extinction using psychological brainwashing and the AIDS virus. But suggesting whites were brainwashing people of color and using the AIDS virus to fend off racial extinction was a bit too progressive for 2003 audiences. Today, it might be a little bit more acceptable. So an editor from one of the local newspapers demanded that Rogers discontinue his column, and Rogers actually agreed under protest. So after graduating from Florida A&M, Rogers went on to earn his PhD in African American Studies from Temple University in Philadelphia, and eventually reinvented himself with the name Ibram Kendi. So after this whole kind of thing in college, where he wrote these kind of radical columns with kind of an AIDS conspiracy theory about whites, he kind of reinvented himself and then came back on the scene. All right. So currently, Kendi believes that the racial achievement gap in the United States is a myth. The very idea itself is racist, he argues, insisting the supposed gap is simply the result of poorly designed, culturally biased, standardized tests. Okay? So to Kendi, All racial disparities are the result of only one thing, and that's racism. This is important because it places the solution not on developing academic skills such as reading, writing, and critical thinking, but on using identity politics to root out supposed systemic white supremacy. So we kind of have this difference between skills and an interpersonal-based solution and a more political systemic solution. So that's Kendi. All right, next is Robin DiAngelo, whose white fragility has made her rich. All right, so just so you know, in this article that I'm citing, they kind of disclose how much money DiAngelo has been making on her lectures and her book. And as of right now, DiAngelo has sold over 1.5 million copies of White Fragility. She's selling them so quickly that Beacon Press, the small press that she's publishing with, is trying to keep up just being able to print them to have enough to meet the demand. So she's made about $2 million off the book. It's come to light that her lectures are making a ton of money. Over the past 2 years, since June of 2018, when she published White Fragility, she's been charging around $20,000 per workshop for her lectures, and she's basically disclosed that she's done about 10 of these per month over the last 2 years. So if you do the math, 10 per month at $20,000 a pop, that's $200,000 a month for 2 years, plus the book. I'm trying to do the math. I want to make sure I get the numbers right. So we're talking $5, $6, $7 million that she's made off this White Fragility. You can say it's a cottage industry. And because it's becoming so popular and so lucrative, more and more people are starting to question this. More and more people are starting to analyze what exactly she's talking about. Because what she was doing in the beginning, she would go to these big corporations, I believe Levi's, I think possibly Nike, but I'm not sure, but many of these bigger corporations would bring DiAngelo in, and she would do her lecture, and in a way these big corporations were just trying to show that they were woke, they were a part of the hip new progressive culture, and they were using White Fragility kind of as a badge to say, hey, look, we're not racist, we're woke, and even DiAngelo was admitting as much, but many of these corporations were not looking underneath at exactly what they were doing and what she was saying. So more and more people, both conservatives and liberals, interestingly, are kind of coming together and saying the same things. A lot of her White Fragility theory is not based in rigorous science. It's based in identity politics. There's lots of flaws with it. There's lots of questions being asked about it. So more and more people are questioning this White Fragility. All right. So she places identity politics over academics just like Kendi does. And she basically thinks that meritocracy and individualism are just a myth. They're not real, which is very interesting and anti-American. She agrees with the National Museum of African American History and Culture's page on whiteness, which we talked about earlier in a podcast, which summarized what it called white culture and believes that values such as work ethic, rational linear thinking, politeness, self-reliance, and the scientific method are not universal or objective, but are now being redefined as white, or are the byproducts of a racist Western white supremacy culture. So she agrees with many of these ideas from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that these ideas of politeness and hard work and meritocracy and individualism are not universal values. They're not things that all children can use and succeed. They're dressed up in this white supremacy culture, and they're kind of evidence of whiteness, racist whiteness. All right, so that's DiAngelo. And finally, this New York Times Magazine article looked at a third person who's not as prominent. He's kind of under the radar. His name is Glen E Singleton, an African-American man. He runs an equity workshop for discussing race called Courageous Conversation. So New York Times writer Daniel Bergner joined one of Singleton's two-day workshops in September of 2019, documenting his experiences in the article, White Fragility is Everywhere, but Does Anti-Racism Training Work? So this is what Bergner writes. Singleton talks about white culture in similar ways. There is the myth of meritocracy, and valuing written communication over other forms, he told me, is the hallmark of whiteness, which leads to the denigration of black children in school. Another hallmark is scientific linear thinking, cause and effect. He said, there's this whole group of people who are named the scientists. That's where you get into this whole idea that if it's not codified in scientific thought, it can't be valid. So Singleton's perspectives are also concerning. Instructing administrators and teachers to put less value on skills like written communication and linear thinking could negatively affect students of color, especially when it comes to college readiness and competition in the labor market. So we have these three anti-racist trainers, and they all kind of have the same ideas. They're placing politics and aims at reforming kind of white privilege and white supremacy culture, the systemic idea. They place an emphasis on that over trying to get into the interpersonal academic skills such as reading, writing, critical thinking, and these values of hard work, believing that children do have some semblance of responsibility and they are, in a way, captains of their own ships. I believe that my students are the captain of their own ship. Now, can they do anything? Of course not. The system does have some limitations. But you should at least tell students that they have the possibility that hard work will pay off and that you reap what you sow. According to DiAngelo, Kendi, and others, this stuff is a myth of individualism and meritocracy, and these are the things that they're teaching them. So, actually, this Times columnist, this guy Daniel Bergner, he mentioned this to them. He said, he wanted to question them about this, and he did. So when Times writer Bergner brought up such a point with Singleton, Kendi, and DiAngelo, none of these anti-racist educators could give a meaningful response. They all failed to explain what should replace such things as written communication and linear thinking, and could only offer circular, propagandistic ambiguities in response. So none of these people had a concrete answer for this. So the point is this. If we are saying to students, meritocracy is a myth, the idea of individualism is a myth, things like hard work, politeness, the written word are just white cultures and part of a white systemic supremacist society, are we truly giving these students the academic skills that they need, or are we kind of leaving them in a place where, to quote the question of this article, we're kind of condemning these children to a life of poverty?